Welcome back to Train Signal. This is Elias Kinaser, and you're watching Managing the Private Cloud. Can you believe it? We've made it this far in this course. It's been an exciting course. Well, we're going to make it a little more exciting, a little more cool in this lesson. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about a bunch of things. But you're probably asking yourself, hey, Eli, we've automated and orchestrated, up and down the stack, the virtual, the physical, the storage, the network. What about the hosts? Do I still need to install these hosts manually, or is there a way for me to automate this? So this is one of the topics that we're going to discuss now. How do we install Hyper-V on bare metal, and what are the requirements? So this is going to be cool. It's going to be short. It's going to be to the point, and let's go ahead and get started with the bare metal requirements. So you're going to need a server hardware that obviously supports Hyper-V. So all of the Hyper-V requirements are going to need to be met by that hardware. There's got to be some compatibility there. That hardware also has to be able to support pre-execution environment, which is PXE boot, so that we can boot directly from the NIC into PXE. So it has to be able to support that. The server hardware also needs to have some kind of out-of-band protocol support. Now, the out-of-band protocol support, typically there's the ones that VMM supports are three. You have the IPMI, the DCMI, and SMASH. Those are the three protocols that VMM 2012 Service Pack 1 supports. And these are typically, you connect to them through baseboard management controllers, BMCs. Those are your HP ILOs, your Dell DRAC, your IBMs, your Cisco UCS. Any way to connect to the actual server out of band so that you can do remote control of the actual console. There's typically an Ethernet port on the back of those servers where you're connecting directly via Ethernet, via IP, to the console of this box to gain access to its physical resources without necessarily happening to be in front of it. This is one of the reasons that we are not going to be able to fully complete the example during the demonstration, because the equipment that I'm working with and the equipment that you're probably working with at home to follow along doesn't have this out-of-band management capability. As a result, our discovery phase, when I show you the discovery phase, it's going to fail because we don't have this capability. I'll be able to take you most of the way through the GUI, but we won't be able to finish this exercise just because we don't have the right hardware to be able to do this. So again, we're going to need an out-of-band protocol. You have three that are supported. You'll have to find out from your server manufacturer which baseboard management controller protocol are they. Well, if it's HP, are they supporting the IPMI or the DCMI or SMASH? So you'll have to find out from your server manufacturer which protocol, which out-of-band protocol they support. Now, the Windows Deployment Services role also has to be installed on your Windows Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 or on your Windows Server 2012, whichever one you're going to be using. It doesn't have to be on the VMM server. It could be on another server for the purposes of our example. And to keep things simple, we're going to install that role on VMM, but it doesn't have to be installed on VMM. Now, for those of you that are familiar with Citrix Provisioning Server and with VMware Auto Deploy, bare metal installation of Hyper-V is relatively similar. It's not the same thing, but it's kind of the same approach, right? So Microsoft is now using a virtual hard drive, a VHD drive, just like the one that we were using to create our templates, to deploy that onto bare metal. Now, if you think about it, well, it's a Windows installation. If you have all the necessary drivers built into that image, well, there's no reason why, if you're deploying that VHD wouldn't install and operate properly. So, and we're going to assume that depending on the types of server hardware that you have, you're building that VHD template with the right drivers embedded in it. So those are essentially the requirements, the bare requirements to get Hyper-V automatically deployed through VMM. Now let me show you the process. I have a really cool slide here that I've borrowed from Microsoft that I want to show you in an animated fashion, the steps that you would take in order to get this bare metal Hyper-V deployed. So the first step is the VMM server is going to communicate with that bare metal system using out-of-band protocols. Again, that'll be your HP ILOs, your Dell DRACs, your Ciscos, some way of remotely managing that actual host. It's going to have to communicate via that. And again, there are three ways: the IPMI, the DCMI, and SMASH. Second step is that actual server is going to pixie boot into the Windows deployment server because it wants to request the image that it needs to download. Step 3, it's going to authorize the pixie boot at the VMM server. Step 4, it's going to download that VMM customized WinPE image onto that bare metal server. Now it's going to run some generic command execution scripts, and I'll show you in the next slide what those scripts are and what exactly it's doing. And it's going to configure the partitions on the actual bare metal server. Once that's done, it's going to download that VHD from the library server that's on the VMM server. It's going to also input any drivers that are required for this hardware to operate properly. Once that's done, it's going to attempt to join it to the domain. It's going to install the VMM agent, and it's going to enable Hyper-V, put it in the right host group. And then it's going to run any post-installation scripts. So these are essentially the steps that it would take in order for Hyper-V to get deployed onto bare metal. Now, we talked a little bit during those animations about the generic command execution scripts and what those are. Now, those could be a bunch of things. They could be firmware updates. They could be prepping the local storage RAID so that you can install and install the operating system on it, maybe partition it properly. That'll be NIC teaming, that'll be iSCSI configuration, and any other remote command execution that it deems necessary. So this is what Microsoft means when they say generic command execution scripts. These are the types of functions that these generic command execution scripts would fulfill. Alright, so let's go ahead and log on to our VMM server and let's install the Windows Deployment Services role. Once on the server, we're going to click on Add Roles and Features. Very simple, very straightforward installation. We're going to simply accept all the defaults here. There's really not much to configure, but I wanted to show you anyway. So we're just going to select Windows Deployment Services. These are some of the prerequisites. Again, accepting all the defaults. We're not changing anything here. These are the two options that we are selecting for this, and we are going to go ahead and click on Install. Once this is complete, we're going to go ahead and click on Close here. You'll find here that it was successfully installed. What we can do now is on the WDS node on the left here, we're going to simply right click on it. We're going to come down here to the Management Console, and then we're going to select the server node here, and we're going to select the actual server. We're going to right click on it, and we're going to go through the initial configuration of the server. Again, we're accepting all the defaults here. We're not changing anything. I'm going to do integration with Active Directory. This is a location containing the boot images. Typically you'd want to change it. You don't want to put it on the same drive as your, for instance, which contains your volume information. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to keep it here. We're just going to go ahead and click on Next. You're going to get this warning that for performance reasons you probably want to put it on a separate volume. We're going to keep it on this volume for now. We're going to click on Yes. We want to select Do Not Respond to Any Clients at this time. That's the default. We're going to keep it at that. Once this is complete, we are not going to add any kind of images right now, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Finish. We're done with the installation of WDS. Let's go ahead and switch over to our VMM Management Console and finish this installation here. On the Management Console, in order for you to add or to make that link between the actual VMM server and the WDS server that we just created, what we're going to do is under the Fabric node, under Servers, we're going to select Pixie. I'm going to right click and we're going to click on Add Pixie Server. Since it's on this server, we're just going to do VMM01. We're going to give it a Run As account that has the right permissions. And then we're going to go ahead and click on Add. And it's complete. Let's go ahead and exit out of here. You'll find that it is responding. Now at this point, if there are any drivers that are required for the hardware that you intend on automatically deploying Hyper-V on, we want to upload those drivers into the VMM library. Now I've already done that. Let's assume you were trying to update or upload or inject a SCSI driver within the environment. I've created a drivers directory essentially under my library here. So if I scroll down you'll find that I have a drivers directory now, and under that I simply have a folder called SCSI. Once you've uploaded the SCSI drivers, and you can get SCSI drivers or you can get NIC drivers, whatever drivers you want, as long as there's an INF that VMM can automatically ingest, right, or inject here, when you double click on it, it's going to look something like this. What we want to do is we want to create a tag for this driver. Now, a tag is something that you can easily identify this driver by, so that you can associate it with the right profile a little later on when we create it, so that at the point of deployment it knows that it needs to inject this driver as part of the installation. So what I want to do now is I want to right click on the driver. We're going to click down on properties, and you'll find that you have this custom tag field here. If you go ahead and click on select, you have the option of creating a tag that is associated with this particular driver. So in my case, if I click on new tag here, and let's name this SCSI. Let's keep it simple. And we're going to go ahead and click on OK. So we've given it essentially the tag, the friendly name, something where we can now associate this particular driver with the tag. Well, now that we have the drivers that we want, we're ready to create a host profile. A host profile is essentially what we're going to use to deploy to bare metal Hyper-V. Now, host profiles are under the profiles node in the library. If you find host profiles here, right click on it, click on create host profile. We're going to name this. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In your environment, you might have different types of hardware that you're going to be using to deploy Hyper-V on automatically, right? You might have HP, you might have Dell, you might have IBM, you might have Cisco, you might have different hardware configurations. And these different hardware configurations require different drivers. Now, you could install the drivers for all of them on the same image, but to keep it clean, you probably want to have an image that you're injecting different types of drivers to. As a result, instead of having that different image, maybe you have a different profile for the different types of hardware that you might want to deploy Hyper-V to. So in our case, let's just assume that we have Cisco UCS in the environment, and we're building a host profile for that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm simply going to call this Cisco UCS profile, and you can give it a more descriptive information here if you choose to do so. Now, if you click on next, the first thing is going to ask you, okay, what do you want to associate this profile with? What is the VHD that you want to associate it with? Now, let's just assume that this particular VHD that we've been using, let's just assume that it is the one that we want to use for all of the profiles, in particular this one. So I'm just going to select it. We're going to go ahead and click on OK here. So now I've associated that with. If you click on this checkbox, then what it will do is it will try to maintain a thinly provisioned image so that it's not using all of the disk space that the image requires. Typically, you wouldn't want to do this when you're installing Hyper-V. First, because storage locally should be readily available, and second, I wouldn't recommend that you try to conserve space when it comes time to installing the actual host. In Hyper-V, every inch, every megahertz matters, every IOPS matters, so I wouldn't recommend it, but you can always select this checkbox if you want to do thin provisioning and try to conserve disk space. I'm going to go ahead and click on next here. Now the option here is to configure a physical network adapter as the management NIC, so you probably want to keep that. Second option is to select whether or not you want to use physical network adapter CDN, or if you want to specify it. So if the physical network adapter CDN is unknown, then keep the first option. If you know the CDN, then you would be able to select the second option here and enter it. Now, the CDN stands for Consistent Device Naming, right? CDN. Really, the real name for this is Consistent Network Device Naming, CNDN. And what this does is typically when you install an operating system, any type of an operating system, even Linux, onto hardware, the first network interface card that it pulls, it'll typically give either ETH0 or ETH1, or it'll name it something, right? Same thing with Windows. The first time you install Windows, the first network interface card that it pulls, it will randomly name it, and it might be, for example, I don't know, Ethernet 4, and the actual position of the actual Ethernet might be 1. So the position of the Ethernet and the name don't necessarily correspond. It just happens to be that that's the first NIC that it pulled, and as a result it names it whatever naming convention it has. Well, CNDN, or CDN based on what you're seeing here on the screen, is a new standard that tries to standardize this naming convention so that it's not that confusing, so that you can figure out, well, which one is the first network interface card, so that you can supply it here or in other places and apply scripts or things against it, and you know that that's the right one, right? So if you want to associate the first NIC with the management interface, well, it would be very difficult, but because you won't know what its name is. But following CNDN standards, if you knew what that was, then you would be able to come in here and give that a name. For now, we're just going to stick with the default configuration here, and then we're going to go to IP configuration. Well, what are you trying to do from an IP perspective? Do you want to obtain one automatically from the HCP? Probably not. You probably want to assign one from the static pool that we had created earlier. So again, it's just going to associate that with it. From a disk perspective, what type of partition do you want to do? Do you want to do MBR or do you want to do GPT? I'm just going to keep it a default. From an OS perspective, again, this is the volume label, this is the volume information. I'm leaving all of this at default, and then you have the driver file. So this is where you can associate any drivers that we uploaded into the library a little earlier with the profile. So depending on whether or not those drivers are needed, you can come in here and associate them. Now, some devices are going to be able to be recognized automatically by plug and play. If that's the case, then great. When it happens where those devices aren't automatically detected by plug and play, you need to create that association. You need to inject those drivers. To do that, you're going to select filter down here, and then you're going to select. If you happen to get a blank screen here, make sure you're going back into your library and you're refreshing it. Sometimes it takes a second or two depending on what the server is doing before it refreshes these tags. So just make sure you go back and do a quick refresh on the server library. Once you have the right driver that you want to associate, you can simply click on Add. We're going to click on OK. We're going to click on Next here. From a domain perspective, I'm just going to go out and give it my actual domain here. And then we're going to give it a run as account so that it can add it to the proper domain. Click on OK. Whoops, next doesn't work here, so you have to go through these. It's kind of confusing with these, specifically with this console. Sometimes you have to click on next to move to the next one, and sometimes you just have to scroll through here. So we missed it here. So let's go ahead and give it the right password in order to add it to the domain. After that, from an identification information, what is the name that you want to give to this Hyper-V host? Maybe, or this is actually the name and organization name that you want to give inside of the operating system. So let's just do this, and then let's do train signal here. From a product key, I'm just going to leave it blank. From a time zone perspective, Central works fine for me. If you had any answer file, this would be a good time to add it. And then if you wanted to add any kind of post commands for startups or shutdown, whatever, you can come in here and add those. I'm good for now. We're going to go ahead and click on Next. If you needed to specify any particular paths, again, to this host profile and that would be deployed to the machine, you can do that. Otherwise, you can come here to the summary screen and then finish. Create new host profile. That was successful. We're going to go ahead and click on OK. And there it is. All right, so we have a host profile. We've added all the right drivers. We've made all the right associations. We have our Pixie server. Everything is configured properly. Well, now the last step is to actually configure a task, a job that would associate this deployment that we've put together with an actual bare metal hardware. So to do that, what we're going to do is click on Fabric, and then we're going to click on Add Resources here, and we're going to select Hyper-V hosts and clusters. Once that comes up, we're going to select the last option down here, which is physical computers. We're going to click on Next. We're going to select a Run As account. This is where you get the option of selecting which out-of-band protocol do you want to use. Again, it's IPMI, and you have the option of selecting Smash as well. This is where I'm not gonna be able to finish the entire demonstration here because again, we don't have any kind of an IPMI or Smash to connect on, but I'm just gonna keep this connected. If you had any particular customized port, you can select that, otherwise leave it at default. Click on Next. Here you have the option of, well, how do you want me to discover the hardware? This is important and interesting at the same time. You can put in the actual IP address of that host. Now, in most cases, you're not going to know that IP address. That IP address might be coming out of a pool. It might be the first time. It might be DHCP. And even if you knew it, it would be hard for you to figure it out and find it because it's probably associated with a MAC address. And typically, if you're doing more than one host at the same time, you're going to have a bunch of them, so it'll be confusing. What you can do, though, is you can select an IP subnet. So if you do this right, and if you configure this right, then you might want to have your, let's say the Cisco UCS servers are always on a particular subnet, where the HP server is on a different subnet, and the Dell servers and the IBM server, each one is on a different subnet. What you can do here is you can do 192.168.1.0 with a /24 subnet, and as a result, you're associating any IP address that comes out of that subnet with this host profile, and it will automatically deploy the Cisco image onto these Hyper-V hosts. Again, one additional process in the automation. You might do that differently. You might have an IP address range that you're associating with all Cisco UCS hardware profiles that are going to get Hyper-V installed on them. You might go with this option. So you'll have a couple of different options to identify an IP address range that says, okay, anything in this range is going to get this profile. Anything in that range is going to get a different type of profile with different types of drivers. We're going to click on Next here. This is where you would go about discovering those bare metal hardware hosts, essentially. You would find them here. They would come up here during the discovery process. What you would want to do is select the ones that you want to provision, and then you would want to click on Next. Obviously, the next step here would be to any provisioning options that you want to add on them, and then you would final deployment customizations that you would make to that, and then you would go about deploying that VHD associated with that profile onto the actual Hyper-V host. So the process is relatively straightforward when compared, with other deployments, especially with desktop deployments where it gets a little complicated. Here it's kind of cool. It's very straightforward to the point, except we won't be able to move any further. So let's go ahead and click on Cancel to exit out of here. And what I want to talk about now are user roles. So to talk about user roles, let's flip back to our presentation real quick. Well, we've talked about user roles in earlier lessons, but we've never really elaborated on it. So let's focus on it a little more here. Let's start with the easy one. Well, there are different types of roles within VMM, but if we start with read-only administrator, a read-only administrator means that they're going to get access to all of the objects within VMM in read-only. They can see them, but they can't modify anything. The traditional VMM admin is also known as a fabric administrator, which means they're going to get access to everything within the VMM console. You can do a delegated administrator by selecting the fabric administrator role and then specifying which objects within your VMM library, or within your VMM console, within your VMM environment, you want to give specific user groups access to. So that becomes a customized administrator role. Then you have your tenant administrator. The tenant administrator, the scope of this particular role is typically clouds only. So you'll be able to create virtual machine networks. You'll be able to assign this role to a cloud, and you'll be able to have access to all of the other self-service user settings, which means over here, this is the self-service user, and I'll show you again when we get into the console what you get out of this. But the scope here is this is the application owners. These are the users that are going to consume these applications that we've been creating for them all along, with specific rights on specific objects. So again, they won't be able to have access to everything. Now, the cool thing here is if you're giving those self-service users access to the VMM console, which you can do, so you can do it either by giving them access to the app controller, kind of that Silverlight web interface like, which we're going to talk about in a later lesson, or you can give your self-service users or your other administrators access to the VMM console. Now, the cool thing here is when you give them role-based access to the console, any object that they don't have access to won't show up. So it'll be like it's not there. Any objects that they have access to will be there with the configuration and the rights and privileges that you've assigned to them. Let's go into the console and take a look at how that works. User roles exist under settings down here. And if you go ahead and click on create user role, you're going to have to give it a name. Let's say we're going to give ours, I don't know, let's do dev role. give it a description, click on next, and here are the different types of options that you have in order for you to configure that role. Again, you can start with Fabric administrators. That's probably not very good for developers. Read-only would be good for your help desk. It might be good for upper management. Again, for our purposes, let's just go ahead and select Application Administrator here, which is also a self-service user. And you'll find that every time you click on one of these roles, keep attention to the left node here, how some of the things will come off. For instance, Fabric administrators here, they'll give you access to the library, right? Whereas if you select Tenant Administrator, you'll find that that's not even an option to be configured. So depending on the type, on the role that you're configuring, some options will go away immediately. For us, let's go through and create Application Administrator. We're going to click on Next. Now we have to associate this role with an Active Directory group. So if I click on Add, and I'm going to do something that's not very ideal, but you kind of get the point. I haven't created an actual group for my developers, so let's just go ahead and associate this with domain admins, but obviously here it would have to be your developer group. Click on OK. We're going to click on Next. Now you want to associate this with a cloud. What are the resources that you're trying to associate this with? What's the scope of this association? It's going to be the WEPS cloud here, so we're going to go ahead and select that. We're going to click on Next. And here you have the option of specifying quotas. Quotas are very cool and very useful at the same time. Now the upper window here, this is the quota that you're associating for the cloud. For this role. So this role, how much resources can they consume out of the cloud? You might want to remove the unlimited here and give it specifics, right? So this role, this developer role that we're creating, can only consume up to 10 virtual CPUs out of the cloud, up to this much memory, up to this much storage, up to this much, in custom resources. And you can scroll down for additional resources like virtual machines. How many virtual machines can this role consume? Now here's the thing when it comes to the lower window. You're associating here at the top the role with a group. That group might have one person in it. It might have 100 people in it. Let's assume it has 10. If it has 10, then these 10 people can consume, all 10 virtual CPUs, all 10 virtual machines. Well, one person out of that group can go out and consume 10 virtual machines and render the capacity or the quota. It meets it at the max. So as a result, the other people in that group won't be able to consume anything. Well, this is where you can control that. Down here, you are saying, all right, well, while this capacity applies to the entire group, I only want to be able to give each user the ability to consume one vCPU, and possibly, for instance, here, let's do one virtual machine, so that users cannot consume all the capacity at the same time. You are putting boundaries around the amount of quota that each individual user is able to consume out of the maximum quota that you're giving them here. So again, this is a way for you to control these quotas when you're applying them to roles. For now, we're just going to keep it at unlimited. Which VM networks do you want to make available? We're going to click on Add. The only one that I currently have is VM Network, so I'm going to make that available. We're going to click on Next again. Now here's where you have the option of populating that cloud library. Remember when we were talking about the fact that there's library and then there's cloud library? The cloud library is what you, as the administrator, is making available from a resource perspective to the end users to consume. Now we're putting together that role, that profile, and we're saying, all right, for you, Mr. Developer, I'm going to make available out of my library, for instance, this particular VM template, and maybe I want to make this particular service template available as well, and I don't know, let's make this hardware profile available. You're clicking on OK, and you're making these available to the users. Now this is really cool. I didn't intend on this to happen, but we're going to keep it. I have actually made available, this is very cool, I've made available a resource that doesn't adhere to the cloud capability that we've configured. And it's this particular Windows 2012 SQL Server template that I'm trying to make available here. It breaks some kind of a capability requirement for my cloud, and as a result, I can't make that available to my end user, and as a result I'd have to remove it. So this is really cool because it's telling you, all right, the stuff that you're giving them is either going to work or it's not going to work, so that will also help. If there's any particular paths, any data paths that you want to make available. This is where if the user needs to upload something to the library, you can make that available to them here, a specific path where they can upload custom information. We're going to click on next. This is where you have the option of specifying what type of action they'll have access to. These are the privileges. What can they do when they're part of this role? And you can go through and say, well, I want to be able, they should be able to do remote connections. Maybe they should be able to remove virtual machines and services, etc. You can go ahead and select one or the other. And once you're ready, we're going to click on next. Run as accounts. Recall when we were talking about run as accounts, I explained to you that run as accounts isn't a way for you to stop putting in your password. It is a way for you to be able to delegate that permission to somebody else without having to always and constantly go about entering username and password that has elevated rights. So if you recall, we can give someone the hypervisor administrator here so that every time they want to add maybe a hypervisor to VMM, they can use this account. Now this is obviously simplified. You probably want to do it for adding to the domain or adding SQL Server or whatever you want to customize here, but you're able to give them that particular permission here without giving them the password. So they'll be able to use these run as accounts. We're going to click on next. Finally, when everything gels and the summary is the way you want it, we're going to go ahead and click on finish. And voila, I don't know why it keeps going to that error message, but it likes to do that. It went ahead and created that particular user role. So that's from a user role perspective here. Let me show you one more thing before we talk about something else. So under VMs and services, now that we've created a user role that can consume virtual machines, that can consume resources, well, I want to be able to use some kind of chargeback, showback, so that I can, when the user is in front of that self-service portal and they're trying to consume resources, if I have a virtual machine that has 2 vCPUs and 2 gig of memory and another one that has 4 vCPUs and 4 gig of memory, if I don't persuade them to make the right choice, well, they're always going to go with the beefier one. But if I put a dollar amount, if I put some kind of a penalty for them to use the more expensive one, well, they're going to think twice about that, right? They're going to be like, well, do I really need that 4 gig? No. They're going to put thought into it. Whereas if you don't do that, they're just going to go with the beefier one all the time. Now, you can do this against a template or a virtual machine. What we want to do is right-click down here and drag down to Properties. And then under Settings, you'll find that you have a lot of customization from a self-service perspective. So over here you have if the virtual machine will be assigned to a self-service user, specify the number of points to apply to it. So for this template, this is our generic template, what do you want the points to be? And these points could be dollars, they could be euros, they could be pounds, they could be anything you want. They don't have to be, a point. Don't think of it as a point. Think of it as a way of telling the user, if you want to consume this particular virtual machine, then I'm going to charge you $100 while this machine is powered on. Now, this happens to be a 2 vCPU 4 gig memory. If you had another template that was a 4 vCPU 8 gig memory, then you would come into its settings and set this maybe to 300, so that they'll know, okay, if I consume this one, I'm going to pay $100. If I consume the other one, I'm going to pay $300. Do I really need it? If you want to associate this VM with a preferred owner, you can do that so that it's always deployed on the preferred one. I'm not going to select that at this time. And then you can do the same thing for possible owners. Possible owners means this virtual machine can exist on any one of those Hyper-V hosts. If you didn't want it to exist, for instance, on Hyper-V 3, you can uncheck it so that the only two that it could exist on would be Hyper-V 1 and Hyper-V 2 as possible owners. So a lot of flexibility here in what you can do from a costing perspective and from a placement perspective as well. Let's go ahead and click on cancel here. Let's click on yes. Let's go back to our presentation. There's one more really cool thing that I want to show you. And that cool thing is called equivalent resources. Now, what does equivalent resources mean? Well, in the environment that we built together, we only have one library server. So it's relatively straightforward. We have one location. We don't have more than one library server. It is likely that in your environment, you're going to have different data centers, maybe different infrastructure presence in different locations around the world. Maybe you have one in Chicago, and then you have one in London and Hong Kong, and you're building this notion of a private cloud. You're going to have more than one library server. You're going to have a library server in Chicago, one in London, one in Hong Kong. Well, if you're trying to deploy a service from London and you need a resource, instead of that resource going all the way to Chicago's library server to get an ISO or a VM template, why can't it point to the library server that is closest to it that might have an available resource that is equivalent to the one that's on the Chicago library? Well, that'll be quicker, that'll be faster, that'll be easier. That also provides for high availability and redundancy of actual resources. What you're trying to do here is you're trying to set equivalent resources, and you're trying to say, okay, this ISO on the Chicago server and this ISO on the London server are equal. So if you're requesting this from the London office, point to this because it's the equal resource of the one that's on the other server. Let me show you how this works in a nice animation here. So assuming you had a VMM server, and this VMM server is creating a service template. This service template is going to point to your resource dependent, and that it's going to be resource dependent on the actual library server that it's on. In this case, that library server is in New York, right? Now, if you're trying to create another deployment service and that deployment service is in New York, well, that's fine because it's on the New York branch. The closest library to it is the New York server library. But if you're trying to do this from Seattle, well, it's going to be slow. And the reason it's going to be slow is that that library server is very far. So again, the same concept as the London and Chicago. If it's in the Chicago office or in the Chicago area, then the Chicago library server is going to be the ideal one. If it's in London, then you don't want it to travel all the way across the link in order to get that resource. Now let me show you how you can set equivalent resources within the VMM Management Console. Under the library node, what I've done to be able to illustrate this example is if we scroll down now, you'll find that I've added another library server. There it is. So we have reference, which is .wiredbraincoffee.com, which is a new library server that I added that has one share beneath that. And then we have the standard VMM library server that we've been using that has, those two shares that we've been using. If you click on library servers up here, you'll find that I have this SWDVD5 ISO image that resides on my VMM01 library. Now, that resource happens to also be available on the reference library, right? So here you go, it's available here. I'm going to go ahead and select it, and then I'm going to scroll all the way up. I'm going to hit my Control key on the keyboard, and I'm going to select this one as well. Now, when you do that, now you have both of them selected. What you can do is you can right-click on it now, and then you can mark it as equivalent. So both of these resources are going to, they're going to belong to the family Windows Server 2012. And, the release, if you want to specify a release, maybe it's 1.0. You don't have to do that. But if you're trying to, be very, very specific, then, you're giving it a release of 1.0 so that, again, the family is being specified here. The release is being specified. The type, the name, it's going to be globally accessible from a namespace perspective. And then we're going to go ahead and click on OK. And voila. You'll see that it automatically added that to the family name here. And now this resource can be accessible essentially from the closest library to the actual user, as opposed to having to travel all the way to the library server that contains that resource. That should be faster and easier for you to work with and significantly help. All right, so what did we talk about? What did we cover in this lesson? Well, we started off by talking about how we automatically deploy Hyper-V to bare metal machines. We talked about the fact that we need the Windows deployment services. We showed you how you inject drivers into the VMM library. I showed you how to create a host profile, how to associate drivers with that host profile. And then we went through the wizard as far as we can go into that wizard into the deployment of that Hyper-V onto bare metal. We then talked about user roles, and I showed you how the different user roles within VMM can accomplish different things. I showed you how you can put a costing around a particular virtual machine so that you're giving one more importance than the other, or you're giving your users the ability to think about which one they want to consume. And then we also talked about equivalent resources and the fact that they're important in that if you have multiple library servers spread out across the world and you have these same resources that are available on these library servers, by creating that equivalency between them, then when they're requesting these resources, it's going to connect to the closest resource to the user as opposed to having to travel all the way across to a different library server. This helps you from a high availability and also resource redundancy perspective. Finally, I hope this lesson was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.